Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I made this beautiful oyster shell wreath using a mixture of decoupaged and hand-painted oyster shells. If you love coastal decor and DIY crafts, then you are definitely going to enjoy this project. So grab your supplies and let's get started. I am using these oyster shells that I picked up from a local seafood restaurant. They are already cleaned and ready to use, which makes this project a lot easier to get started with. If you would like to learn how I clean and prep my oyster shells, be sure to check out some of my other videos where I share a full process along with a few helpful tips and tricks. To get started, I'm going through my stash of oyster shells and laying everything out so I can figure out about how many shells I'll need. For the base, I'm using a simple metal wreath ring that I picked up from the dollar store. It's inexpensive and makes the perfect foundation for this project. I am using a white acrylic paint to paint the inside of each oyster shell first. I like to apply 2 coats so the finish looks nice and even. My favorite paint to use for this step is a chalk paint that I usually pick up from Walmart. But you can use any white acrylic paint you have on hand. To speed up the drying process, I like to use a small fan. Honestly, who has the patience to wait for paint to dry when there is so much crafting to do, right? Now that the base coat is completely painted and dried, I am going to sort and organize the shells. For example, these 3 shells are much deeper than the others, which would make them harder to decoupage, so I'm going to set those aside to be painted instead. A few of the shells have bumps and imperfections, so I'm going to use those for decoupage, since the napkin will help hide those flaws. The flatter shells are definitely easier to decoupage, so I'll place those into the decoupage pile. And just like that, I'll sort through all the shells based on which method they'll work best for. The deeper shells, or the ones with smoother surfaces, will go into the painted pile, while the flatter shells, or the ones with imperfections, will be saved for decoupage. Now that my shells are all sorted, I can finally start painting them. I'm going to begin by painting a few of them with this metallic white paint. Adding some white shells into the mix of blues will help soften the overall look of the wreath and give it a more balanced, elegant coastal feel. I also recommend applying 2 coats for the best coverage and finish. Let's tackle the blue shells next. Originally, I had the idea of using a blue metallic paint, so I picked up a few different shades of blue from the craft store and painted some sample shells to test them out. I knew I wanted to use this napkin design, so I was trying to find the blue that would match it the best. Now, if you notice that this napkin looks a little different from the one I showed in the final reveal, you were absolutely right. Keep watching and you'll soon find out why. After testing out the metallic paints, I ended up changing my mind and decided to go with this blue chalk paint instead. The rest of the shells that I placed into the to be painted pile are going to be painted with this beautiful blue chalk paint. The color is called Ocean in case you would like to recreate this look for your own project. And just like before, I recommend applying 2 coats for the best coverage. As you can see, the shell on the right only has 1 coat, while the shell on the left has 2, and it already looks so much better. Now moving on to the decoupaged shells. At first, I really wanted to use a napkin with this beautiful hummingbird and floral design, but when I tested it out, the colors actually changed after I applied the matte Podge. I wasn't a fan of the purple tone it turned into, so I decided to switch directions and go with this blue floral napkin instead. In the end, I'm really happy that I changed my mind because I absolutely love how the whole project turned out. To start the decoupage process, we first need to separate the layers of the napkin. This napkin has 3 layers, but we'll only be using the very top printed layer for our project. Carefully peel away the extra white backing layers so you are left with just a thin decorative sheet. Before I start, I'm going to cut the napkin into smaller pieces. This just makes the decoupage process a lot easier to work with. When cutting them out, just make sure each piece is slightly larger than your shell so you have enough to cover the surface. Grab your matte Podge and apply a thin, even layer directly onto the shell. Then place your napkin piece on top and start smoothing it out gently from the center moving outward. Press it down carefully and be sure not to rip the napkin since it's very delicate. If your fingers start getting tacky, you can use a piece of clear plastic wrap to help smooth out any wrinkles without tearing the paper. Once you are happy with how it looks, apply a thin top coat of matte Podge over the napkin to seal it in, then set the shell aside to dry completely. After your matte Podge has completely dried, gently rip off any excess napkin around the edges. Then take a piece of sandpaper and lightly sand the edges to remove any remaining bits of paper that didn't come off cleanly. Inspect your shells and apply a little extra matte Podge if needed. Pay special attention to the edges. You want to make sure the napkin is fully sealed down. Lastly, I'm going to finish each shell by adding a metallic gold paint around the edges. I like to use an angled brush for this step because it gives me more control and helps create a clean, even line. The thickness of the gold edging is really up to your personal preference. Go as bold or as subtle as you like. And as always, I recommend applying 2 coats for the best coverage and more polished finish. With all of the shells painted and decoupaged, it's time to apply a protective top coat. For this step, I'll be using a UV resin. To apply it, add a small amount of resin onto the shell and spread it out evenly. I'm using a silicone brush for this, but a toothpick works great too. I really like using UV resin because it gives the shells a beautiful glossy finish and cures much faster than traditional epoxy resin. When working with resin, make sure to wear gloves and a mask and work in a well-ventilated area. As you spread the resin, you might notice a few bubbles forming. To remove them, I'll quickly pass a small torch over the surface, which helps pop the bubbles instantly. Lastly, I'll place a shell under my UV light to fully harden and cure the resin. I'll repeat the same process for all of the shells that I painted and decoupaged. Before we can assemble everything, we need to prep the wreath base. I didn't want to leave the wireframe exposed, so I started thinking of different ways to cover it up. At first, I considered wrapping it with ribbon, but I really wanted to keep the curved shape of the wireframe. I figured the curved shape would allow the oyster shells to sit more naturally against the base and give them more surface contact, which would help the glue hold better and make the wreath sturdier overall. But then I realized that if I really wanted to take advantage of the curved shape of the wreath frame, it would work better to weave twine through the wires instead. So for this step, I picked up some jute twine from Walmart and started weaving it through the wireframe. One roll was enough to completely cover the base, although I will say this part was definitely a little time-consuming. I'll show you the beginning of the process so you can get an idea of how I did it, but honestly I ended up finishing the rest off camera while watching a TV show. Basically, all you do is pull the twine over the wire and then under the wire, repeating the pattern all the way around until the entire wreath frame is covered. Two hours later, and the wreath base is finally wrapped. That was definitely a lot more work than I expected. To finish it off, I taped the ends of the twine so they wouldn't fray, and then I used a little hot glue to secure everything in place. And now we are finally ready for the final assembly. To attach the shells to the wreath base, I'll be using a combination of hot glue and E6000 for a stronger hold. Before gluing anything down, I want to lay all of the shells out first to make sure I like the arrangement. I am alternating the decoupaged shells with the painted ones to keep the colors and patterns balanced throughout the wreath. Once I'm happy with how everything looks, I'll start gluing the shells down one by one. Because I live in a hot climate, the hot glue alone can start to soften when the wreath is outside in the heat. The hot glue helps hold the shells in place immediately while I'm working, and the E6000 adds a much stronger and more durable bond once it cures. Using both together helps make sure the shells stay securely attached even in warmer temperatures. I hope you enjoyed this project and that it inspires you to give it a try. If you like this video, you can support my channel by hitting the like button, and if you don't want to miss any of my future DIY projects, make sure to subscribe. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below in case I forgot to mention something during the process. I'll be happy to answer them. I can't wait to hang this wreath on my front door and proudly display it for everyone to see. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time in my next video.